In this video, we'll try to understand how we can handle concurrency issues in Entity Framework. Now, before we move ahead and we talk about concurrency, let's first try to understand this term concurrency, and then we will see how we can implement the same in Entity Framework. Now, concurrency is a problem which actually occurs in a multi-user environment. Take this simple example over here. Let's say we have some data called as X. Okay, let's assume that there is a data called as X in SQL Server somewhere. And let's say two users, that is user A and user B, both of them start editing that X data. So let's say the user A starts changing this X data to value A, and let's say user B starts changing this X data to value B. Both of them have still not committed this data to database. They are still making changes offline. Okay, so let's assume that there is an application where both of these users have pulled the data on the screen and they are changing this X data to A. So the user A is changing this X data to A and user B is changing this X data to B, and still they have not committed to the database. In other words, they have not pressed on the save button. So now let's assume that the user B first finishes and he commits this data to database. So in other words, user B first presses the save button and saves this this B data to database first. After that, X presses the save button and he makes a physical commit to the database. So first user B has updated the X value to B. After that, the user A has updated the X value to A. Now here's the confusion. So the user A thinks that he has updated the value from X to A. Okay, user B thinks he has updated the value from X to B, and currently B is the actual data in the database, right? And both of them are misguided. Why? Because actually user A did not update the value from X to A, but actually he updated the value from B to A, because before he made the changes to the database, the actual value was B, and user B thinks that the last value which is saved now in the database is B, but it is actually A, right? So in other words, this confusion is termed as concurrency. So concurrency is nothing but it's a confusion which is created in multi-user environment, when multiple users try to update the same data at the same time. So now in Entity Framework, how do we handle this? Concurrency problem can be resolved by using locking. Now you can apply two kinds of locks on the data. One is a pessimistic lock and the other one is an optimistic lock. Now I will not go into details of what exactly is a pessimistic locking and what exactly is optimistic locking. What I would suggest is, we have three great videos in .NET Fundamental section, where I have explained what exactly is a pessimistic lock and what exactly is an optimistic lock. Now coming to Entity Framework. Entity Framework can only apply optimistic locks. They cannot apply pessimistic lock. So in other words, if you want to solve concurrency problem in Entity Framework, we need to use optimistic locking. So let's go ahead and let's try to understand how we can implement optimistic locking in Entity Framework. So in order to understand concurrency in Entity Framework, what I've done is, you can see that I have created a very simple table here called as TBL customer, and it has a couple of records here. And also I have created a very simple console application here, you can see. So here's a very simple console application, and in this console application I am updating the first record. So the first record here is Shiv. So this Shiv record I'm trying to change to Raju. So what I'll do is, let me go and run this console application. So you can see that I've started my console application here in a debug mode. So there it goes. So you can see that the code is running in the debug mode. So now you can see that I have loaded the first record Shiv into memory. Okay, and I'm changing this Shiv to Raju. Okay, so I go and change this Shiv to Raju, but I'm not going to call save changes. Okay, now because we don't have a multi-user environment, we have only one computer. What you can think about is, this code is user 1. This is user 1 who has loaded the record Shiv. He has changed it to Raju, but he has not submitted changes to SQL Server still. Okay, now user 2 is this guy, the SQL Server person. Okay, so we are trying to simulate the multi-user environment, where the user A is actually your Entity Framework code and the user 2 or user B is actually your SQL Server edit. Okay, so currently this guy has changed Shiv to Raju, and now here somebody goes and changes Shiv to XYZ. So he goes and makes a change, of record Shiv to XYZ. Now what happens? Now this person, who is actually loaded from entity framework, he thinks that he is making change from Shiv to Raju, but actually, the actual value is XYZ, right? So what happens? He goes and he says save changes, right? So this goes and happily updates here. You can see Shiv has now changed to Raju. Okay. So this guy thinks that he has updated from Shiv to Raju. Okay. But actually the data was XYZ. This person who is in SQL Server thinks that the last data what is there in SQL Server for customer ID 1 is XYZ, but actually the last record or the last update is Raju. In other words, this is concurrency issue, right? So what I would like is, that the time somebody changes record somewhere else, right? I would like that at this moment, when I call save changes, I should get an error saying concurrency exception, right? So in other words, I'm doing an update on a screen, and when I say save changes, if somebody has changed record in SQL Server, I should get some kind of a error over here. So in order to do that, what you need to do is, we need to go to the design mode. So, go and open your EDMX in the design mode. Now, we want to implement concurrency for customer name field, right? We don't want to implement concurrency for customer ID. Why? Because customer ID is an incremental identity seed. Okay. So right click on this customer name here and then click on properties. So right click here and click on properties. And then it opens up a property window, and in that property window you can see that there is a nice property here saying concurrency mode. So go and change this concurrency mode to fixed. Right, there it is. Now let me go and save this, and now let me again go and run my application in a debug mode, and let me try to see that if the concurrency problem gets resolved or not. So what I'll do is let me quickly go back to SQL Server. So let me just go and change it to Shift for now first. Right. So I'll go and run this console entity framework application. So there it goes in the debug mode. It loads the record Shiv. Right. So you can see that so there it is. So you can see that he has loaded the Shiv record. This guy is changing this to Raju, right? But he has not clicked on save changes. Now I go back to my SQL Server. So Alt Tab, and I change this to XYZ. So some other user has changed it to XYZ. This person has changed it to Raju. So what should happen is I should get an exception here. So because I have made the concurrency mode as fixed, if I do a F11 here now, you will see that I get an exception, DB update concurrency exception. So in other words, entity framework has automatically handled optimistic locking. So what this exception says? This exception says that these records have been modified or probably they have been deleted at the backend. Okay. So what you can do now is you can put a try and catch here, catch this DB update concurrency exception, and then you can take appropriate actions, saying that are you sure you want to update, or probably you want to say that are you sure you want to revert the data of what is there on SQL Server, into your application. So, depending on different situations, you can then take appropriate decision. So in other words, if you want to handle concurrency exception, right, what you need to do is right click on the property, on the field, say property, and then go and say concurrency mode as fixed. Now this is good, we are able to implement concurrency, we are able to implement optimistic locking. But now think about a situation, where you have a customer class and it has like 50 or 100 properties. So going to each one of these properties and marking them as concurrency mode as fixed is a big task by itself, right? So what we can do in this situation is we can go and create only one field in SQL Server with the data type as timestamp. And we can only check the timestamp field, rather than checking each one of these properties. So in other words, what we can do here is we can go to SQL Server very quickly. Let me do a Alt Tab here. So I go to SQL Server and I open this DBL customer in a design mode, and I will go and add a field here called as timestamp. Now what is a timestamp field in SQL Server? A timestamp field is nothing but it actually provides a unique GUID value every time you update a row. So in other words, here I'll just say last updated. So here last updated, and I will keep the data type of this field as timestamp. So you can see that I've created here a field called as last updated, and the data type is timestamp. Now remember that timestamp does not mean date and time. It does not mean hour, minutes and seconds. It means it's a unique GUID value. So for example, you can see this first record here which has value XYZ. Let's say I go and change that to Shiv. Okay, so let's say I go and change it to Shiv here, right? So what it does is, every time I update this value here, he goes and modifies this last updated field, with a unique value. So if I do a execute here, you can see that he has generated a unique ID called as 7D5. Okay, if I go and change it again back, let's say I change it to Shiva here. Okay, so if I say here Shiva, and if I again do a refresh here, so the first value was 7D5. If I do execute again here, the value is 7D6. So in other words, every time I update the field or update a row, it generates a unique value in the timestamp field. So what I'll do now is, rather than checking on each field, right, I will just go and check concurrency on this field, right? So what I'll do is, let me again go back to my entity framework, and let me go and update my entity model here, because I would like to get that last updated date and time field here, right? So let me right click and say update model from database, and I'll just say finish. So there you can see that he has pulled up that new field, and again we need to go and set the concurrency mode to fixed. So let's go ahead and right click on this last updated field here, and let me set the concurrency mode of this last updated field to fixed. And what I'll do is, I'll just go and remove that customer name concurrency mode to none, because now I don't need to go and set concurrency mode on each one of these properties. Only I need to go and set on the last updated one. So that I've already done. So again, I would get the same kind of effect here. So if I go and run this program here in a debug mode, so you can see that he has loaded the record Shiva, right? I'm changing Shiva to Raju, okay, and I'm not making a physical commit. Now let me go back to my database here. So let's go here and change this Shiva to XYZ. Okay, let me again go back here, and now if I do a save changes, it will throw me exception. So you can see that he has again thrown me exception. So the best practice would be, rather than going and marking each field to participate in concurrency, what you can do is that you can create a new field, one separate field called as last updated, or whatever name you want to give. Mark that field as timestamp in the database, and then only do concurrency check on that field. So what you can do now is, you can go and catch this error. So you can say that, okay, you can wrap this context.save changes into a try and a catch block, and then you can handle concurrency over here, right? So probably you'd like to handle concurrency by throwing up a message box saying that somebody has changed the record, do you want to continue or not? Or probably you'd like to say that somebody has changed the record, so please go and reload the new record and then again come back. So it again depends on how you want to handle concurrency, right? So what we'll do is, in the next video we'll talk about how to handle concurrency in different ways using entity framework. Right, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. In this video we were trying to understand what exactly is concurrency and how to go and solve concurrency problem in entity framework using optimistic logging. Thank you so much.